Done. All right, so let's get started. If anyone needs to join us late, then that's fine. So thanks so much for coming to the webinar, More Than Just a Pretty Chart, Realising the Power of Data Logging. My name's Freya Allen. I'm a consultant speech pathologist for Liberator over here in WA, so a little bit earlier in the morning over here than any of our East Coasters who are joining us. I've been working for Liberator for nearly 4 years, and I'm really excited to be sharing with you today a little bit about how to use realised language and data logging to enhance your clinical practice. I really love looking at AAC data. I'm probably a little bit of a nerd in that respect, but I know that a lot of people don't share my sentiments about looking at data logs. So hopefully after today, you will have an opportunity to have a look at how you could use it in your clinical practice and maybe not feel so daunted by the idea of data logging. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. We are recording today's webinar, so if you guys could keep your microphones muted as you've all done so beautifully when you've logged on, that would be fab, unless you've got a question. So we should have enough time today if you've got a question as we go along to just ask it. Otherwise, you are more than welcome to pop them into the chat window and we can get to them at the end. So up to you guys. Yeah, and so that chat window is that little speech bubble up in your list of options, which hopefully you guys can see. Apart from that, I think that's all the housekeeping. So let's get started. Now, hopefully, there we go. All right. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so you might ask yourself, how does that apply to data logging and AAC devices? So let me explain. So wouldn't it be cool if we could really see what was happening on our clients' devices, if we could picture it? So the good news is that we can, and we do that using data logging and data analysis using realised language. So the concept of looking at pictures to start to kind of understand data is something called data visualization, and that's the root for the saying, a picture tells 1,000 words. So what we know about the human brain's neurons is that they are involved in multiple functions, and that 2/3 of the brain's neurons are dedicated to vision. So that's a huge amount of our brain neurons firing around vision. And so because of this proportion of neurons that fire for visualization, for vision, data visualization is a really fantastic way to better understand data, because it helps us uncover trends, provides insight, explore sources, and tell stories of the data. And I think a really relevant example of this at the moment is all the data graphs that we keep seeing around the COVID-19, the curve, and looking at that particular data set. So as a bit of a data nerd, I'm really appreciating all of that data visualization that the government is employing to show us, how we're going with flattening that curve, how we're going in relation to other countries and their data sets. And I find that much easier to understand than if we were just looking at sets of raw data for each country. So when we're thinking about creating graphical displays, there's a few things that they should do. So obviously they should show the data, that is the point of them. They should encourage the viewer to think about what the data is actually telling us, so the substance of the data, rather than giving us necessarily information about the method of collection, graphic design, that sort of things, which should really allow us to hone in on what the data is trying to tell us. They should avoid distorting what the data has to say. So I'm sure we all know that you can make data fit any particular course that you're trying to do. So data can be manipulated to make things appear better or worse depending on your agenda. So good data visualization shouldn't do that. It should make large data sets really coherent, so really concise. They should encourage the eye to compare different pieces of data, and different visualization methods do that differently. And they should reveal the data at several levels of detail. So we can look at a really broad set of data, and we can hone down then to a really fine structure, and really fine detail of that data. And the data should serve a reasonably clear purpose. So why have we collected this particular data in that particular way? So that's in general when we're looking at data visualization. So those points are for any data visualization that you might see. What is data logging? So as distinct from data visualization. So data logging in relation to AAC devices, which is what we're going to talk about today, is a feature that's available on some devices and apps, that captures the language that's produced on that device. And specifically, it captures when the buttons were pressed, what words were generated, and how those words were generated. And so when we have that data, we can then use that to create our data visualizations and have a look at how our clients are going. So today we're going to have a quick look at very briefly about why we data log. We're going to have a chance to experience some data logging in its raw form, and then also have a look at some of that generated through Realize. We're going to quickly learn about data logging on a device, and specifically about how to set the device in general up. We're not going to go into specifics for each device because it's obviously quite different for each device, but that's something that I'm more than happy to chat with people on a one-to-one basis if they want to know how to set their particular client's device up for data logging. We're going to use Realize language to see some data. So I've got a case study from some of our colleagues over in the US who did some really nice data comparisons, and it's a really lovely example of how you can use data to set goals and to pull the team around that client in really nicely. And then we're going to talk about some benefits, barriers, and just considerations at the end. So why do we collect data? And I think probably the more pertinent question is, how can we measure the effectiveness of an AAC system being used by an individual? That's really what we want to measure. And so there's a number of ways that we do this, and most clinicians have their little toolbox of things that they use, whether it's trial diaries or use diaries or little check boxes for families. And we rely on a combination of things, and by no means should using Realize language take over all of those things. You really need that multimodal data collection, but Realize language and automatic data logging can be a really useful part of this picture. And it gives us an overall view of how a client is using their system throughout the day, throughout their lives. And so initially, we need to measure the effectiveness of one system over another. So if we're looking at that trial and prescription phase, using the data to determine which system works for that client the best. And then we continue to assess the effectiveness of that chosen system over time. So comparing its use with its own use further down the line. So just a quick definition for you about what is automatic data logging. So it's a term applied to the automatic recording of data that can be analysed to produce a time-stamped transcript of what has been generated using an AAC system. So not revolutionary, pretty straightforward, and it should include information such as which buttons were pressed, the date and time of use, and what words were spoken. So the first thing that we need to do when we're thinking about data logging is turn it on. So this is really, really important because by default in all of our devices, data logging is turned off. And there's no way to retrospectively get that data if we didn't turn it on. It's not collecting it anywhere in the background in the back of the computer. If we don't turn data logging on, it won't be there for us. And when I'm supporting people with their trials particularly, I always say to them, we could decide at the end not to use that data. We turn it on, the trial's a complete disaster, you know, everything's totally hit the fan. We can decide, look, it's not even worth us going through that analysis process. But if we don't turn it on in the first place, we don't have that luxury. So the best thing that you can do is just turn it on and see what happens. And you can decide, look, it's not worth using it, but it's fabulous to have that luxury to decide not to use it rather than getting to the end of your trial or your intervention period and realize that you don't have that data. So what I'm going to do just to illustrate is I'm going to play this video, and when I was testing it out, I don't think the sound comes through the GoToMeeting, but there is a transcript at the bottom, and it's just to get you guys to see what sort of language is being used, so then we can have a look at the data afterwards. So hopefully it won't matter too much that the sound doesn't work. So just a book share activity. They're using a word power vocabulary and talking about animals and the sound that they make. So lots of talking about these animals. Some really lovely modelling. I'm sure we've all done a book share activity. All right, I think that's probably enough of that. All right. So a little interaction like that, we could pull the data off. And if we pulled the data off and loaded it just into our computer, it would look something like this. Now, I'm sure that's probably quite small on your screen. And I do have these as PDFs that I'm happy to send around to people. Yeah, and I can make the slides available, absolutely. So this is what a raw data file looks like. So I'm not sure how many of you would have ever seen a raw data file, but there's a few things to just kind of point out. So we'll always have the date in brackets sort of before each long list of automated data generation. We've got these non-language codes, which tell us things like what location the row and the column is, key activation, whether that word was accessed using a spell page or through page navigation. So even just looking at the raw data, we can get quite a bit of information already without actually having to delve too deep. And even just looking at the raw data can help us to start asking and answering some questions. So it can give us information about days and times that the device was used, how many words were said. So if you guys can see that on your screen, I know it's probably really small, but the actual voice output is bolded there. So we can see lots of read, verbs happening, the noun book. So that starts to give us an indication of words that are being said. We can drill down even more and look at what verbs are being said, look at high frequency of words and those sorts of things. And that's just by us looking briefly at some raw data. So when I first started in the area of AAC, realized language didn't exist. So we would have to look at that raw data and pick out the trends ourselves. And so it was really laborious, and I'll admit I probably didn't use it as much because it was really laborious. So thankfully, we now have the option. You can still do that analysis by hand if you want to, but we have the option of being able to put that data into realized language and it do some of that generating of some of the different graphs and things that we'll have a look at in a minute. So that's really good, and in terms of time, it's a huge time saver. So for that activity, that book share that we just watched, this is the word cloud for that activity. So this is an example of one of the data visualizations that we're able to see, one of the graphs. So the frequency that the word was used is indicated by how big it is. So we can see that owl and meow and hoot obviously were used quite a lot in that activity. So they are larger than, say, some of the other words like book, reading, hamster. So we can get just at a quick glance an idea of the types of words that child was using. Another really cool graph from that activity is looking at parts of speech. So looking at the noun versus verb proportion can give us a nice indication of where she's at from a linguistic point of view. Looking at other parts of speech. Just as important as looking at what is present is looking at what isn't present. So she hasn't used any adjectives, no conjunctions or prepositions, which given the type of book, we probably wouldn't expect that. But it's just interesting to note the things that aren't being used as well as what is being used. We can then look at each specific word group. So if you were to touch any of these word groups along the top in colour, it would then pick out those word groups within that list of all of the words. And again, the amount of times that they were used is indicated by how big they are. So read and turn were accessed more than see and is from a verb point of view. One of the other questions that data logging can help us unpick is, when does your child, student, client use the device? So if you ask that to some people in your client's life, some people talk about when their client uses the device from an environmental perspective. So they'll talk about almost where it's used. So it's used really well in therapy, or we use it at school, in the classroom, that sort of thing. Other people will use a sort of quantifier to answer that question. So talking about, oh, they use it every day, or they use it really often, or not that much, those sorts of things. Some people will talk about communicative function. So when they use it is to request and greet people, those sorts of things. And then some people talk about internal factors, so things like motivated. So, when they're really motivated, that's when they use their device. So there's nothing wrong with any of those responses, and they're all really valid to that question of when is your child, when is your student using their device. But it would also be really nice to have a way to quantify that data set of when the client is using the device. And so what if we use data logging to answer that question? So if we go back to, and this is going to be really difficult for you guys to see, but it's just another raw data file. So we can see the date and time of when buttons were selected. So in terms of knowing when buttons were accessed, we can get a really, really precise indicator of days and times that that student is using their device. So this is just a summary of that really awful to read data file. So for this particular student, over just that data set, which was, I think, about a week that they were collecting. So we can see that the device was used in some capacity on those 4 days, and they're 4 days in a row, which is really fabulous. And we can also see the time of day that device was used. And so we can see that even just from looking at the data represented in this way, from that time of day, we can see that the device is used between sort of 12 and 1:30. And then there's this sort of outlier where it's used at 8:45 to 9. And again, we can look at what's not in the data to help us to start asking questions. So why is it used in that time period but not in the morning? Why is it not used in the afternoon? The use of the device seems to be concentrated around that middle of the day type period. And it's more concentrated then and not throughout the rest of the day. So what happens in that time period to make that happen? So just from a really quick, brief look at that data that we were able to pull, we can see some trends and also start asking more questions to get more information. And that's something that I really love about looking at the data, is it just really helps us hone down on really specific questions that are going to have a huge impact on our clients' use of their device and how we can best support that. So to get even more specific information, like we've been talking about, we can put our raw data into Realize. And so I'll send these slides around. There's a bit.ly video about how to do the upload. Like I said, I'm more than happy to chat people through over the phone how to do that as well if you want to know specifically for your client's device. So this is the same data set in visual form. So again, we can see now real lack of use of the device in the morning, and then that really concentrated use of the device in that middle of the day period. And then on Wednesday, there seems to be a chunk of time there. You could maybe surmise that maybe that's an after school therapy session, something like that. So we can really easily see when the device is being used really well and also when it's not being used. So why is the device not used in the morning? What is it about the environment or the support people in the morning that is preventing the use of the device? Why is it never used on the weekend? Does the device stay at school? Does the device stay at school and it's flat in the morning, and so we plug it in and charge it and it's ready to go by the middle of the day and we get some use out of it and then the child goes home? They're all really important things for us to try and drill down into, because none of us want our client to be only using their device for 2 hours in a really concentrated period of time during their school day and not at any other time. So, and it's a really nice visual way to talk to other communication partners as well and say, hey, I've just pulled the data off so-and-so's device. It's really interesting. I can see some really fabulous, like what happens between like 1 and 2 on a Wednesday, because things seem to be going really well then. Okay, why are the other days different? What is it about those other days? Is it that the EA who's at school on a Wednesday is really fabulous at using the device, really confident, but it's a different EA on Monday and Tuesday and they're not so confident? Maybe we could do some training with them. Maybe they could be mentored by that other EA who's working with that student on a Wednesday. So just starts to help us kind of pick apart some of the issues. I found it a really useful way to have that conversation. So instead of trying to have that conversation without any form of kind of concrete information for the other people, it just helps to open up that conversation, and not in a, you are not using the device, why aren't you using it? But just in a more gentle way about, oh, what's working well here and how can we replicate that across the other days? So using data logging and in conjunction with realized language, because I think particularly, right now, time is really precious, and so it's probably not feasible to be looking through those raw data files. So using realized language in conjunction with that automatic data logging, like I said, can just help us ask better questions. And looking at data in relation to other data. So we might say that graph on the previous slide, well, there's some days that aren't going so well. But if we had data from 6 months ago that shows the device never got used, and then we looked at that graph, we would say that's a massive improvement and how fabulous that we're working towards those goals. So we never want to look at that data in isolation, and that's what's really valuable about collecting data and analysing it periodically, is you can start to see those trends. And it can help us set up the environment better, increase awareness just of the device's use. Sometimes just the fact that people in the environment know that the data logging is turned on, that awareness can just naturally increase how the device is being used and how much it's being used. Like I said, it's never intended to point fingers or to say you're not doing as well as that person. But I always frame it as, if that person is using the device more, how can I support you to get to that similar level? What can I do in my capacity, say as the Liberator consultant? Can I run some training at the school so that we can get everybody up to speed? And like I said, I have found that as a really useful method to approach those conversations when maybe you do want to say, well, I know you're not using it. This can just be a nicer way to approach that conversation. So now what we're going to do is have a look at the process of collecting data. And we're going to do that, like I said, within the setting of a case study. So something to point out is that data logging has actually, the capability for devices to capture this automatic data has actually been around for 30 years. But it's still not part of most people's day-to-day clinical practice in AAC. And I think that's really interesting. I think a lot of it has to do with that we didn't have the ability to have that data analysis done for us, and that the time to analyze that raw data is really laborious. There is a metaphor that I came across when I was putting together this presentation about data logging and that sort of thing. And so when you're describing the kind of importance of language sample analysis and data logging, is that data logging is a bit like flossing. Once you understand its value and its importance, so data logging or flossing, most people would understand and agree that it's something that you should do, but neglect to do on a regular basis. So it's not part of your routine. And so today, hopefully, through going through this case study and some of the information, you guys will hopefully see the value of data logging, but also how to get started. I think that's one of the tricky things, is people know that they should do it. They know the capability is there, but there's just a barrier maybe of how to do it or how to get started, or is it worth my time and investment into setting it up and doing it properly. So hopefully at the end of today, you're going to say, yes, it is worth my time and effort, and you'll be able to see how this particular case study, how they used it to set goals and to really enhance their clinical practice. So like I said, it's been around for 30 years and it's available on all PRC Liberator devices. So if your client has one of the Liberator devices, data logging is available. So this is sort of a quick flow chart of the kind of process around data collecting and analysis. So obtaining permission is always the first step. And this is really, really really important, and I can't stress that enough. I don't want anybody to go and turn the data logging on their client's device without obtaining that permission. Never. Whether it's a child, whether it's an adult client, we should always be getting permission. So you might need to explain a little bit about what it actually is, what are we collecting, and what are you going to use that data for. And I've found that most of the time people are pretty happy for me to turn it on once they know how we're going to use it. And also if I show them some of these graphs, so what sort of information we can get from it. And for people who are really hesitant, sometimes we just say, look, let's do a week and then we'll turn it off. We'll just get a bit of a snapshot and then I'm happy to turn it off. And more often than not, after that week and we look at some graphs, they're actually okay with keeping it on. But it is just really important to have that conversation. We're listening in basically to what people are using their voice to say. And, I for one know that I wouldn't want someone kind of following me around, recording everything that I say on a day-to-day basis. So, really important that we give our clients that same respect. This is a consent for language sample collection template that I found on AAC Institute. I know some organisations have their own templates set up. I don't think there's any right or wrong template. Some people, you might be fine with just that verbal consent and having that conversation and recording it in your clinical notes. All organisations and people's practices do things differently. If you feel like you need that documentation to kind of cover yourself, then there are definitely templates out there. So once we've got permission, the next thing to do is to check the date and time on the device. And again, this is different for each device, so we're not going to go into how to do it, but more than happy to talk to people afterwards. But if we have a look at, this is just an example where the date and time is not correct. And if you guys can see that, you can see that this particular data is being collected in May 2020, which, as we know, has not happened yet. And so for me to then be able to analyse that data and try and make some of those inferences about the data and what's happening, I need to be sure that the date and time were correct. So there's very little point in me having a look at it and going, oh, the device is not being used at school, but it's being used at 3 a.m. If the date and time aren't correct, then I can't pull any inferences from that information. But if I know the date and time are correct, then that helps me to start asking those questions about, well, why are they using it at 3 a.m.? That's really strange, and not at school, those sorts of things. So date and time correct is really important. And particularly if you're using a trial device, it's always the first thing that I check, because inevitably the devices come from a different state. So even if the date and time has been set, it's probably not correct for your state. And often the device, or all of the time, the devices are reset to a factory default. So they'll be reset to when they were first ever turned on, which for some of our devices is 2014, 2015, and obviously that data is not going to be very useful to you. So once we've turned the data logging on, once we've checked the date and time, jumping ahead, now we're going to turn the data logging on. Again, different for each device. Just to reiterate that by default it will be off, so we need to turn it on. And again, more than happy to talk to people about how to do that. And there are little indicators on most of the devices to let you know that it's on just by a quick glance at that home screen. So you can see down the bottom that little graph that's on the top of that vocabulary there lets me know that the data logging is on. Something to just point out here is data logging is not a perfect science. So sometimes people will say to me, oh, but I'm doing a lot of modeling on the device, so how do we know if it's me or the client using the device? And the thing to remember is that it's not a perfect science, but that if we collect enough data, then we can be confident in some of the comments that we're making about that data. And for some of the time, it doesn't actually matter necessarily whether it's the client using it or if someone's modeling the language to them. You can, in the devices, program in model markers, but in my experience, that almost creates just that extra element of work. I mean, it's hard enough to get some people to model on the device, let alone having to hit the model marker before and after they do the modeling. So in my experience, I haven't found that using model markers has been particularly helpful because of just that barrier. Anytime you put up another barrier for someone to use that AAC system, they're just going to be less likely to use it. So in my opinion, it's okay to have modeled information in that data set as long as we know that it's there. So we're not going to be able to say hand on heart that everything that's in that particular graph is something that the student or the child or the client said. But we know that, so we can make some inferences and we can talk about trends rather than honing down onto specific numbers of, oh, their verbs use has increased by 200 verbs in the last month. We probably can't say that specifically, but we could say that their exposure to and their use of verbs has increased. Because even if someone is modeling, if we see an increase in use of verbs on the device, even if it's being modeled to them, in terms of working towards a goal, that data is still useful to show that there is much more modeling in that goal area happening. So that's my kind of take on modeling and communication partners sort of messing up the data. I think as long as we're aware of it and we are cautious in the way that we interpret data, then I think it's totally fine. So the next thing is to obviously use the device, and by using the device with data logging on, it will collect data. And then the question of when to collect data. So it sort of depends on why you're collecting it and maybe your goals. But you might want to collect and pull out some data for particular areas. So Gail van Tatenhove often talks about the importance of collecting and comparing data that's obtained throughout the day. So just as the client is going about their regular day, during what you know is a spontaneous interaction, and then through elicited language therapy activities. So we can, using realised language, pull out those particular subsets of our data set. And in the case study, I'm going to show you how they did that to be able to look at this particular student's, the difference in how they use their device during a structured language activity and during just spontaneous interaction throughout the day. Then we need to get the data off the device. And again, that is specific to the device, so happy to chat with people about how to do that. Or there are some resources on our website to look at that. And then have a look at and think about that data. So once we've got the data into realised language, there are a number of different ways we can look at the data and different bits that we can pull from the data. So there's this area called use, which looks at 15-minute periods, daily, weekly, monthly, gives us an overall picture of the use of the device. And this is an example of a graph that you might get when you're looking at device use. We can have a look at the specific words that are being used. So using that word cloud, using that top 10 that we had a look at before, and we'll have a look at again. We can get a list of just all the words by frequency. So lots of specific information about words. So here's a couple of examples of a word cloud and a top 10 display. We can have a look at the log, which is an even more specific look at the time that the device is being used, so broken up into kind of 15-minute intervals over the week or over the month. And that looks something like this, which we've had a look at before. I know that's probably really tiny for you guys. But yeah, we can drill down into specific times of the day and have a look at, yeah, why is that device being used on that day really well, but not on the other day. And we can look at language analysis. And this is probably one of my favourite areas because it lets us get to the nitty-gritty of the types of words and parts of speech. And there's, again, a few different ways that it can display that. So we had a look at this one already, looking at parts of speech, looking at proportions of nouns to verbs. And I found this particular graph is really useful to show progress towards particular language-based goals. So quite often a goal for a trial might be, increased use of verbs, verb phrases, that sort of thing. Particularly a lot of kids or clients in general might have a preference towards nouns. And so we can see over time that noun to verb ratio can shift, which is really encouraging for people to see. So now, hopefully you're all still with me. Now we're going to have a look at the case study. So like I said, this is a case study that was completed in the US by one of our colleagues at Frankie Romick Company. And I just really like the way that they've used the data to show change and to pull the team in and really get everybody working cohesively. So in this particular case study, it was a team approach. So this was a primary school age student using a NovaChat with word power, which is hopefully a vocabulary and a device that you guys are somewhat familiar with. And the team working with the student is shown there. So parents, teachers, a primary speech pathologist, and then AAC consultant. So that would be the Frankie Romick consultant, or the equivalent would be someone like myself or your Liberator consultant in your state, and then other health professionals, so people like occupational therapists, physiotherapists, those sorts of people. So for this case study, what they did was mum signed a sort of permission thing to say she was happy for data collection. The AAC consultant trained the team. So did a bit of a general training, overall training of the system, and also looking at data analysis, and assigned roles. And that's another really important thing. So who's going to pull the data off? Whose job is that? Whose job is it to do the analysis? Whose job is it to reset the data if you're going to reset it at the end of each collection period? And so having that spelt out at the beginning is really helpful. Everybody knows what they're doing. Whose job is it to charge the device? Is it going to be charged at school or is it going to be charged at home? All of those things are really important to have set out from the beginning of any trial. Verifying the time on the device, checking the date was correct, and they decided to collect data at 3 intervals, which aligned with their school term. So that they could then use it to set IEP goals for the next term. And so then what they did is they collected the data and they met periodically. So the speech pathologist did the analysis, and then they had like a case conference at the end of each period, and they looked at the data and then did some comparison and set goals for the next sort of quarter. So This is sample 1. So this is after in the first term. Their school year runs a bit differently, so you'll see in the subsequent ones the different dates. So this is like the November sample. So just having a look at this, we can see quite heavy device use throughout what we assume is the school day on Monday and Tuesday, and then things really drop off towards the end of the week. So that's really interesting. And there's also no device use at home, which is also really interesting. And so having that data to then have that conversation during the case conference. And so for this particular family, the child was a little bit verbal, and mum said, look, he just doesn't need to use it at home. We can understand what he's saying. Their routine at home was quite structured. And so he just doesn't need to use it. He doesn't reach for it. We don't need to use it. Okay, that's fine. Not an uncommon comment. Obviously, we'd like him to be using it more because mum doesn't always know what he's saying, but it's okay at this point. But it's let us have that conversation with mum. The other thing that they noticed, and it's again going to be really small for you guys, but there's no device use at 12 o'clock throughout the week. So even on the days like Monday and Tuesday where there's quite heavy device use, there's no device use at 12 o'clock. So what they ascertained through the case conference was that the EA goes to lunch at 12. So between 12 and 12:30, the EA is not in the classroom, and so the device doesn't get used. So that's really important information for us to know, because what we've worked out is that without that EA being there, that child is not using that device. And so we need to train up some more communication partners. We maybe need to do some training with the teacher. So when that EA goes to lunch, the teacher can step in and do some of that, maybe modelling or encourage that student to use their device. So yeah, just really useful information. The team worked out that the student was quite refreshed and motivated at the beginning of the week to use his device, and then that sort of peaked out towards the end of the week as he got more fatigued and more tired. So again, useful information for us to know. Maybe there's some things we could do to rectify that. Maybe have some more motivating activities to use the device with in the later half of the week to increase his use. And yeah, why was it not consistently used, and why is it not being used at home? So they were able to answer some of those questions. Having a look at the word cloud from sample 1. So I have definitely seen a lot of word clouds that look like this with iPad right in the middle. Obviously, highly motivating icon that he knows how to access, I would say, pretty independently. And you can have a look at, if you guys can see it, there's quite a lot of nouns in that word cloud, and something for the EA to kind of just have a look at and, maybe take note at this point about maybe some of the vocabulary that she's modelling in the classroom. So different way of displaying similar information. We can see the iPad really like top of the top 10 by a long way. Encouraging that the verb play is second, although they did know from that for that child that it was part of the learnt phrase I play iPad, and that play was not necessarily being generalised to other activities, but it's okay. He knows where play is, and we can see that. This sort of thing gave them confirmation of something that they already knew. So they already knew he was using it to request iPad. Bathroom is in there, playground. There's also quite a high, so within that top 10, there's some topic-specific words that related directly to the topic that they were learning at school, which I'm not sure what the topic was, but the words are corn and rake, which makes sense that if they're working on them in a classroom, say a termly focus, it makes sense that they're in the top 10. But what it indicates is that for this child, we might need to be thinking about other, maybe more core vocabulary that we could be modelling within that topic-specific theme in that classroom, because he doesn't have a lot of words. So are corn and rake really useful top 10 words for him? Probably not. So it just helps to kind of maybe reframe the way that the EA is modelling vocabulary for him, and maybe the types of questions that he's being asked within those activities. Maybe they could just change that slightly so that he's using more core vocabulary to get those answers to those questions. Then what they did, so like I said before, you can pull out particular subsets of data. So over on the left is his spontaneous language sample over 3 weeks. And then the one on the right is a 30-minute therapy session. So because the time and date were correct, you're able to pull out that therapy session and analyse that data on its own. And that's really, really interesting, because what you can see is that in his spontaneous language sample, really noun heavy, not so much kind of pronouns, and those other parts of speech are quite low levels, considering they're over 3 weeks, that he's only used an adjective 19 times is quite low. But within a therapy activity, and this is what we would expect to see, because in the therapy we're working more on those language goals, but you can see that his noun to verb ratio has switched, so we're seeing more verbs, and that some of those other, so things like adjectives and prepositions, are becoming more evenly accounted for within the data. So that's really encouraging to say that within that therapy session he's being exposed. Not necessarily that he's the one using that, remember, because we don't know if they're models by the speech pathologist or him using it. We might assume that it's a bit of both. But his exposure to those other parts of speech is increased. Whether we can say he's using them or not, his exposure to them is definitely being increased. So after this sample 1, the plan was to have a chat with home about that home use, and is there maybe during his homework they could be using the device a little bit more, looking at increasing different types of words used in the classroom, so increasing adjectives and verbs, increased aided language stimulation as opposed to just prompting. So they were sort of just prompting by pointing to the device or like pointing to the icon that he needed to hit. So they decided to make a concerted effort towards actually modelling. And then they were going to reevaluate, redo a data analysis for the next 2 months and look at IEP goals. So we're going to quickly look at sample 2, and then we're going to have a look at sample 3 compared with sample 1. So sample 2, so this is another 2 months later, home use has increased. So he's starting to use it a little bit on the weekend, and he had an increased overall use of the device. So across the week, using it a bit more, using it a little bit more at home, a bit more of an even distribution across the week, which is fab. They saw a slight increase in verbs and adjectives, which is good because that was something they were going to work on, and some more word combinations within that school period. Now, they've noted that they're not sure if it's the EA modelling, maybe 2 word phrases, or if it's the student doing it. But like I said, either way, it's great. It's either the student doing it, and that's amazing, or it's the EA doing it, which is also amazing, and giving the child more aided language stimulation around those 2 word phrases. This particular client, they also looked to increase the vocabulary file from word power 48 to word power 60. Now, it's not something that we necessarily advocate. And what I don't want you guys to do is go away, do some data analysis and change all your device users' vocabulary files. But for this particular student, they had a goal around increasing verb use. And one of the ways that they determined that they could do that is to increase the word power 60, where you've got a higher proportion of verbs on the home page, so less navigation. I obviously don't know this student, but you know, they would need to make sure that he could physically access that that vocabulary set at the 60 cell vocabulary size and all sorts of things. So you don't need to do that, but it might just highlight some of those things. If you were thinking that they might not have been on the right vocabulary anyway, doing some data analysis might just help to give you that evidence to do it. And then, so after that, then they decided to collect data again in what is May, so would be their third term. So this is where the data is really nice to compare kind of where we were to where we are. So the November sample is that sample 1. And then if we look at the May, so the sample 3, we can see a huge increase across the later half of the week. He's using the device a lot on a Thursday, whereas in the first sample, he was barely using it. So that's really lovely and really encouraging to see, and really motivating for the school staff to be able to see, you know, anecdotally, they might say, oh, we're using the device so much more, but so lovely to be able to give them that graph and say, here you go, you actually, yeah, I can see you're using it more. Looking at parts of speech, so we can still see a pretty noun-heavy analysis within kind of spontaneous speech. But what is really encouraging is the increase in the rest of those parts of speech, which were basically non-existent in November. He's suddenly getting some interjections, some adverbs, some prepositions, and some determiners. So although he's still quite a noun-heavy kid, he's expanded the parts of speech that he's accessing or having exposure to. So that's really encouraging. This is the word cloud. So the thing about word clouds is they can be different day to day. So they're probably not as reliable as some of those other graphs, and it depends on the data set that you're pulling. But one of the really nice things is that there isn't such a standout favourite word in May. So iPad has got significantly smaller. And you can see some more verbs in there, things like want and play, and some adjectives like yellow, big. So just really nice to see, and that reflects that broadening of the types of words that he's using from within those, between those samples. So really quickly, just looking at some of the possible limitations that the team observed. So time was a huge one. So time is really valuable, and when something's new and not part of your routine, it's obviously going to take more time to get it up and running. And there's time involved at sort of all of those steps of the process, and particularly looking at the data analysis, so running the data analysis and then having the time as a team to get together and have that case conference and nut things out. You know, not everybody has that luxury of being able to sit face to face and have those conversations. But I think there's other ways to do it. You could do it over email, and you could facilitate it that way. The cost. So Realize Language is a subscription website. However, all of our new device users get a Realize subscription as part of their device purchase. So if you have anyone who's using a Liberator device who you don't think has access to Realize Language, definitely reach out to your Liberator consultant in your state, because we will be able to get you a subscription for those device users. So that's a huge barrier, I think, broken down in terms of the cost of things. Again, Realize Language isn't going to give us all of the information. We still need to use our other forms of data collection. We're not going to just leave all of those other data collection methods by the wayside. We're going to just add the Realize Language in to our toolbox. Obtaining permission is a potential barrier. I mean, they were lucky that this family were happy, and also happy for us to use the data for training purposes, but obtaining permission could potentially be a barrier and something that you might need to work through. The willingness of the team to participate. I mean, we all have worked with varying different other professionals who are not so keen to do some of this collaborative teamwork, but I think if you can get started and show them how it will be useful to them, then that's the best way. If you can help a teacher to set their IEP goals for that student based on some data that you've collected, that can really, pull them in to see how useful this tool could be. And like we've talked about, that data logging doesn't include when modelling is happening and what level of prompting. So we still need to be collecting those other forms of data collection as well. But as a conclusion to the case study, the team overall found that they had better team communication because they had these regular, real problem-solving, goal-orientated sessions. The team was really motivated because they knew that they were going to be able to kind of see the outcome of all of this increased effort. They knew the direction that they were going in. So, when you know where you're going, it's much easier to try and get there than if we're just saying, I'm going to increase my modelling. Well, how do we quantify that? How do we show whether that's been achieved or not? For this particular speech pathologist, she then used this case study as a sort of framework to use with her other students. So she started adopting the whole doing the different samples within specific timeframes and then now analysing it and doing those case conferences as a framework for her practice. And of course, we have seen some increase in client use and their use of language, and that is the end goal for all of us working in this field. Is we want to see our clients using their systems more and in a more effective way and being, competent communicators. That is our end goal. So I really feel like using data logging and realised language can help us to get there. So I really hope, I know we've a couple of minutes over, I really hope that this webinar has given you guys a little bit of information about using realised language to your advantage. Hopefully it's broken down some of those barriers for you guys in terms of, is it something that I'm going to include into my practice or not? Like I said, I'm more than happy to talk to people over the phone for their specific clients if there's things that you guys want to talk about or problem solve, or things that you feel like are barriers to you guys doing this. There's also more information. So if you jump on our website, there's lots and lots of information just in general about our devices and support resources and trial handbooks and lots of information there. And also Realised Language has some lovely little videos of, different data analysis and how to do the uploads and that sort of thing. But apart from that, that's me. They're my contact details. If you are based here in WA, we also have Kelly Savage, who shares the consultancy role with me. And if you are from the East Coast, then you can jump on our website. If you're not linked in with your Liberator consultant already, you can jump on the website. All our contact details and days of work are there. But I would really encourage you guys to reach out to your Liberator consultant and help you get started if you're sort of feeling like you just want to jump in but you're not quite sure how. So thank you so much for joining me. Does anyone have any questions? I saw there were some questions in there and my beautiful colleagues have jumped in and answered them. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away or type into the chat box. I think we're probably, no worries, everybody. I hope it's been useful and not too dry like data analysis can sometimes be. Perfect. All right, well, it doesn't look like there's any questions. So have a fabulous day, everybody. And feel free to touch base and reach out if you need to.